966.
We have a theme, so let's stick with it. Dakar Rally, we have a bumpy year ahead for oil's price in 2022. Richard, it's likely to be a volatile year for oil this year, but just like the 966 podcast, oil is off to a strong start in 2022. Strong start.
20 episodes, baby.
That's right. Brent crude on Tuesday jumped to $80 a barrel, its highest since November. OPEC Plus agreed to stick with its planned increase for February of $400,000 barrels coming back online. The group, led by Saudi Arabia and including some non-OPEC members like Russia, did so based on indications that the Omicron coronavirus variant would only have a mild impact on demand. We will see. The decision was welcomed this week by the Biden administration, which interestingly added to its statement that it was in close coordination with Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the decision. Richard, we have talked a lot about oil markets and energy on this podcast, but that's sort of by design. Oil is what Saudi Arabia wants to diversify away from, but still remains key in the short term and medium term for the kingdom. So I guess where we sort of want to start with this is we're looking ahead into 2022. What are we looking at in terms of oil's price going forward this year?
I chuckle at your reference at a bumpy year ahead, potentially a bumpy year ahead. We should remember that close to not more than 18 months ago, Brent was $9 a barrel. And I think we have to give some credit to Saudi Arabia and OPEC in terms of its management. And I say that because, so September 2016, this was after 2 years of depressed oil prices. After oil November 2014, we know that OPEC meeting, Saudi Arabia declined to withdraw barrels from the market. Price crashed after being high for a long time. It depressed for a considerable period of time. September 2016, Saudi Arabia and Russia, OPEC and Russia, if you'd like, agreed basically to create OPEC Plus, which gave them much more, I guess, not control or much more ability to move the markets. And between that time, 2016 September and essentially 2020, they took over 2 million barrels per day off the market, which sort of settled the price, moved it back up into $65 range. And you got something a little more predictable, a little more consistent, which is a positive. Now, they had the hiccup in March 2020 when in response to the COVID pandemic, OPEC wanted to take another 1.5 million barrels off the market. Russia said no way. Saudi Arabia said, forget you. We learned our lesson in the 80s. We will not be stuck with holding the lost market share bag. And this is a lesson they learned in the 80s. And they applied it in November 2014. They applied it in March 2020. And as a result, so they flooded the market essentially. And as a result, prices crashed. And that's when you got that $9, a barrel. And West Texas Intermediate went even farther south. It went negative. But people forget, that was a month. They fixed it in April, and obviously we were well into the pandemic at that point. Economic activity was plummeting, so there was all sorts of surplus. But they eventually took off for the rest of that year, 2020. They took close to 8 million barrels off the market. Again, stabilized the markets as pretty ably. And one of the interesting things, and I think this is something that will play into 2022 in terms of how we see the markets and how bumpy they may be, but how we read the markets. So in August 2021, OPEC Plus agreed to begin increasing production by 400,000 barrels per day each month, and that's to continue through the end of 22. Part of that deal was we're not going to meet, we're going to meet monthly now, and we're going to meet monthly to address and adjust production targets as necessary, and that increased frequency I think is good for the markets because it gives you some consistency, some transparency. As the communication is more frequent, and so on and so forth. So I think in that regard, to get to this point, $80 oil. After, like I said, 18 months ago was $9 Brent, is notable, and again, good for OPEC Plus for managing that. And you also saw today that oil stocks are now just are back to pre-pandemic levels. So my sense is my sense of this. High oil prices. If you want to call $80 oil high oil prices, high oil prices are the cure for high oil prices. We saw in December that the Permian production, U.S. shale, largest ever in December, and the projection for January to beat that largest ever. So U.S. shale is slowly coming back online. I don't see, maybe it'll stay at 80. I think that'd be nice for the Saudis. I think the Saudis like a 70 to 80, would take 85 band. But I see it sort of leveling out. You've got supplies. We don't know what's going to happen with Omicron. It's certainly slowed down a little bit, but certainly in general, economies are expanding again. And so I think it'll bump around, but I don't see it going much higher. Again, I'm not an oil expert, but that would be my guess. I also don't see it being particularly volatile. I'd like for it to be fairly steady and level, and OPEC Plus has shown a pretty good propensity of late to manage and avoid big fluctuations. Let's set aside March 2020 when they had their little tiff after their marriage. And that, by the way, as I said, September 2021 marked the 5th year anniversary of OPEC Plus. It's sort of become just, we've all forgotten that it was a new thing not too long ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always plugging previous episodes that we've done on the 966, but we just released a really awesome topical conversation with Kate Durian, who is an energy expert and a former reporter in the space. Just really, really good conversation with her about energy markets. It's really interesting that today Bloomberg featured an interview, a televised interview with Jeff Curie from Goldman Sachs, and he noted that the only two countries in the world that can produce more oil today than they could in January 2020 are Saudi Arabia and the UAE, adding that all other producers will struggle to hit pre-pandemic levels. So it's very interesting. And you also mentioned price. I think it's interesting that Saudi Arabia is always looking at the price as, if price starts getting too high, the drive to sort of separate consuming nations from consumption of oil starts to become a lot more urgent. So if the price goes to $150 a barrel, all of a sudden America and China are going to start saying, we got to find a way to not consume so much oil because it's so expensive. So the Saudis are not interested in just raising the price as high as they can get it. No. They like that sort of sweet spot of $70 to $90 and being in control of it.
Yeah, they definitely want to manage the price. Now, I think I'm going to say this again later when we do our yellow segment, but it's worth saying twice. Your point about Saudi Arabia and the UAE is really important because capacity and the ability to produce at high levels doesn't just happen. And Saudi Arabia is at this, is expanding, trying to expand production capacity from 12 million barrels a day to 13 million barrels a day. And you will see later but they're investing. One of the investments is an offshore oil field that they're just pumped in $4 billion. You don't get this kind of ability to be a reliable producer, and much less a reliable swing producer, unless you set aside money and you really commit to it, and you make hard decisions where this is something that we prioritize over something else. And it cannot be emphasized enough that the Saudis have really handled this natural resource responsibly.
Your one big thing last week was that new oil that has come online in 2021 hit its lowest level in 75 years.
Right.
So I think that's, first of all, I think what you just said is really well said, but I think that's really notable. if more oil is not coming online, I understand that the world is, and I sort of think that 2022 is going to be the first year looking back that we will say, okay, this is where the global energy transition began. It's not, it isn't, but after COP26, there's sort of an attitude change about the energy transfer. There's a general timeline of nations around the world pledging to be net zero with carbon emissions. So it just feels like this is a pivotal year, but taking that and then juxtaposing it with the new oil, producing more oil today than they could in January 2020, investment in new oil online, you sort of see a, fuzzy picture of what we're looking at here in the oil space.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things, the COP27, which I think next year is in Dubai.
Oh, interesting.
I'm not sure. It's maybe Abu Dhabi or Dubai, but one of the things they said coming out of the COP26 was, all right, we have these pledges. Come back next year with hard commitments and updated hard commitments. And I think this COP26 was different from the Paris Agreement in 2015, in that people took it more seriously. There was no discussion of whether climate change is real, and that you had I think 130 nations with NDAs with national commitments, and they came back and said, all right, so we had a lot to deal with in COP26. Next year, 1 year from now, let's make these pledges commitments. And so it's interesting when you say 2022 may be a pivotal year in terms of renewable and clean energy and that sort of thing. Maybe that's the case, and maybe you come back and you have some really, hopefully, maybe you have some really striking commitments.
Yeah, and we talked about this as well. The Saudi Arabia sort of doing its own green initiative announcement and launch before COP26 was a statement in and of itself. It was, we are sort of agreeing now that this is where the world's going, and we're trying to get ahead of this. So I am also now repeating myself, but I just think I think there's a lot going on here, and it ties to energy, it ties to minerals, and everything Saudi Arabia is doing with Vision 2030, and obviously climate change. So,
but again, to self-plug and self-promote, one of the reasons we wanted to speak with Kate Durian, and one of the reasons Saudi's energy scene is so interesting, is they are, and this has also came up in our discussion with Chris Johnson, who's a good friend and a really informed lawyer in Saudi Arabia, has been applying the Saudi legal system and Saudi economic and commercial environment since 1978. So he's a unique resource. But what we talked about with both Chris and Kate was, Saudi Arabia is an expansionary mode on crude oil, on renewable energy, on natural gas, on clean energy, hydrogen. They're just going full bore on all fronts. So it's just, and that's fascinating. But I echo your recommendation that the conversation with Kate's very good.
It's great. And the sun never sets on the 966 podcast. You can listen to it whenever, if you miss an episode or if you want to go back, it's always there. The sun does set on the podcast that we're recording right now. As you can see, Richard's room getting a little darker.
Well,
so
I'm looking. I was just going to say, I'm spectral over here. I usually I shut out all the windows. There's windows here. I'm going to take it down because, the sun did go down.